Welcome back. We've been looking at the aftermath of the blaze in the Johannesburg CBD. 77 people now known to have died. Well, the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa, or SERI, has rejected the claims of politicians that NGOs prevent the evictions of tenants from hijacked buildings. SERI says the tragedy in Johannesburg was a wake-up call for the city and for its leadership. We're now joined by SERI's Litigation Director, Nomzamo Zondo. Ms. Zondo, thank you for being with us. So this, I think your name has come up, SERI's name has come up because the acting mayor, Kenny Kunene, was threatened with court action for unlawful raids. And politicians say often it's hard to get people out. Have you opposed evictions in the past, and why? Just give us your side.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Francis, sorry, I don't know why I thought of Heidi. Francis, so SERI has been acting for unlawful occupiers since we started practicing as a law clinic. People approach us to say we are threatened with eviction. How can you assist us? In almost all the cases that we've been involved in, and I think in all the cases in the inner city of Joburg, the residents that have asked us to oppose the evictions because they cannot afford to house themselves elsewhere. And we've been involved in legal proceedings. We've ensured the City of Johannesburg has notice of those legal proceedings, and we've requested that they intervene by providing alternative accommodation. And so the City of Johannesburg, as you referred us to, Kenny Kunene's raids, has used raids as an intimidatory tactics to push residents out of buildings. I was just in preparing for this interview. I was going through some of the articles that were written following the Cape York fire in 2017. And in 2017, again, our position was very clear, and our position was, in order to stop such fatalities happen, there's 4 things that the City of Johannesburg can do. 1, it can ensure that all buildings have access to basic services. I imagine, I don't know as yet, I imagine that the outcome of the investigation into the fire will tell us that someone was using some other method of lighting, of cooking, of heating themselves, because there's no electricity in the building. If there was water, probably would be sitting with a different story. But also, we're saying the city can intervene by making living conditions in these buildings better, safer for residents. And we're saying that they're actually empowered to do this. First of all, they're obligated to do this by the Constitution and the law. But also they're empowered because there is the emergency housing program, which provides finance for the city to provide such interventions.
So
let
me understand what you're saying, because as far as this one is concerned, and we know that there are many hijacked buildings, so you have these mafia-style landlords who come in and charge people rent. Are you saying that while they are in place, the city should still provide services, let's say water and electricity, but aren't you then enforcing a system, or do you first get the landlords out and then help the tenants? How would it work in practice?
Sure. I think in practice, the first thing, as I've said, is to provide the basic services. If someone is collecting rent,
even if the mafia-style landlords are there, you still provide services.
But of course, the first thing that you are able to do immediately is to go and open a case of hijacking. Because in fact, the hijacking is the offense of collecting rent in a building that you do not own without the consent of the owner. So the easiest intervention in a case where there is such a landlord is to report them to the police. In fact, in relation to evictions, the state has, in as much as private property owners must evict, but the state also has powers to bring eviction applications. So if, for instance, the city decides or believes the building is unsafe, they can bring the eviction proceedings. Of course, the response has to be, we are evicting you from here because we believe that you'll be safer in this other place that we have prepared for you.
Yeah.
And Heidi, sorry, Francis. One of the things that's important and that's been lost here is this building. What do we know about this building? I'll tell you 2 things that I know about this building. This building is owned by the City of Johannesburg. this building up until 2018 was leased out by the City of Johannesburg. We also know now that in 2019, the City of Johannesburg was still operating a clinic in that building. And at that time, the building was being unlawfully occupied. It was in the process of being unlawfully occupied. And instead of the city addressing that unlawful occupation, it moved the clinic elsewhere. It closed down the clinic and left the building as is.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, this one, no NGO can be blamed. I think it was leased out to the Provincial Department of Social Development as well for a while. So you have government departments involved. Should the law change? What would you say to those who say the law is kind to squatters? We know it is, because sometimes people just have nowhere else to go, but then it ends up being very kind to these mafia landlords. You know, anybody can go and get a court order and try and stop an eviction, and it drags out in the courts.
So the one interesting thing, Francis, is if you invite the Johannesburg Property Owners and Managers Association, JPOMA, they will tell you that in as much as it's hard to bring an eviction application, in fact, their biggest headache is having the city comply with court orders that it provides accommodation to those who will be rendered homeless. And I'm saying to those who will be rendered homeless because in the process, the city is able to verify people's incomes, is able to verify whether or not they can house themselves, and is then able to say to a court, we'll only provide accommodation for these 20 people. If we were asking for the law to change, we would have to assume that we're not living in the country that we're living in, where 60% of the population lives outside the formal property system. 60% of the population in South Africa lives outside of that. When you're talking about an unlawful occupier in South Africa, chances are you're talking about a poor black person. And that person is someone also who's probably unlikely to be able, even in the next 5 years, to be in a position to financially put themselves in a position whether they are lawfully occupying a building or they own a building or any type of property.
Yes, and I hear you.
And so if you're asking for the law to be changed,
so desperate. They must have been so desperate. We've run out of time, so I can only ask you this quickly. Is there a possible negative side to this? Because we know that people have been waiting for housing for years and years on the one hand. Could there be a negative precedent if you land up in a very unsafe place and you are given a house because of that, you're moved out, you are evicted, and you get a home? It becomes an incentive for people to try and land up in these unsafe buildings. Does that make sense?
It doesn't make sense to me, Francis. And the reason it doesn't make sense is that the people who live in these buildings themselves, those who are in unsafe buildings, would prefer not to be there. So no one is going to put themselves in the line of having of such a safety risk or a health risk purely because there's a small chance they'll get housing much later on. The reality is also that housing hasn't manifested. If the City of Johannesburg would be here to tell us how many housing opportunities is given to evictees, it would be less than 1,000 units, and that less than 1,000 unit in each and every stance, there's been a court order process that sometimes has to be followed up because there's non-compliance.
All right. Thank you. We appreciate your time and that full explanation. That was SERI Litigation Director Nomzamo Zondo.